start over. This is just to remind everyone, and I will send an email tonight, that for Art 1.2, this class, your exam is on Monday, this coming Monday, a week from today, on the 12th, from 3 to 4:30. And the first slide will be on the screen at 3:15. So I think there was a typo in one, I believe, one version. I think I made more than one that I might have corrected. But in any case, some of you have a version of the syllabus at the last line of it where it talks about the timing of the midterm. It probably, I think it said 6, and that's my bad. I was, dealing with the class prior to that where I had to get 3, sets of syllabi all sent in to my students and the administration. They require copies too, not just students, before a certain deadline. So I apologize, but that is pretty obviously the only fair thing, is you shouldn't be expected to attend a class that's not in the same time as the one that you've been taking. So it will be 3, let's say log on like most of you do by 3:05, and that gives you a few minutes to prepare, ask questions. The first slide will hit up the screen. All this will be in an email, and I will send that tonight, which will be from 3:15. Most of you will be done in an hour. I will keep the last slide, the extra credit slide. There will be an extra credit one, optional, until about 4:30, and then you still have till midnight, like you did with the first midterm. Same format. We'll talk all about that, how to study, what to review. Welcome. We're just talking about the midterm, not midterm, the final, the last exam, which is of course 1 week from today. It's same format, and I will briefly recap, but it's exactly the same way of grading. 8 slides and 5 IDs, 3 slide essays. We'll recap all that in class on Wednesday. You definitely want to attend the Wednesday class, because that's where you'll get all the information about what slides are removed from the study list and from the list of terms to know. Okay, and now that lecture will be recorded, but you should be here in real time to ask questions that may occur to you during the lecture. We will finish probably the first half of the class on Wednesday. 2 days from now will be the last new slides from late 20th century painting, and then we will do the review for the exam and discussion of it. By the end of that class, you should have all the information you need to know and 5 days to study for the test. So our last meeting is 1 week from today, Monday the 12th. Also, there are other deadlines approaching. One is I still don't have some late work, either a research paper or one of the midterms from, I think it's 5 people. And I'm going to do this one more time. I don't want to do it on Wednesday because we got to focus on finishing the last new slides and going over the test. So this is the only time I'm going to do this. Time I'm going to do this. I'm not going to say what, if you hear, or anyone who listens to this as a recording, it will be posted, of course, along with the Wednesday lecture on YouTube by 8 p.m. on Friday. Then you'll know that you need to get in touch with me and or send me something. And I think you'll know if you're missing something, because if I didn't get it, you didn't get a grade. That means you don't get credit for that. And that's each assignment, remember, is 1/4 of your grade. 100 points are all equally weighted. So Afra, Ahmad, these are the people I don't have a full 3 assignments, both the research paper and both midterms. So there's only a handful. I'll just briefly mention, and we'll go on to one other thing about extra credit. So Afra Ahmad, still missing assignment from Gabby Mays. Actually, I only have 1 assignment on that person's list. Brian Pollock. Okay, we're down to just the last couple here. Let's see. Tamara Talbold, and then 2 more, Ethan Thompson and Jake Walton. Also, I never got the second midterm actually from either of them. So sometimes people send things in and they don't usually go to my spam folder, but I do check that. And if you are one of those people and you did send it in, you'll have proof. It'll be obvious. You'll have an email trail that you sent it in by the deadline. Or if it's a late paper, you can still do it, but you'll have a cutoff of midnight on Friday this week. That's in the syllabus. That's true for almost all the other art history classes. we have to start shifting gears to grading, grading final exams and all the grades for all the students the week after Christmas. They moved our deadline up by 4 or 5 days to submit your grades, so you have them in your inbox, your student, portal by whatever the first day after New Year's is. So I cannot accept any late work after Friday. But last announcement now, and we'll get to our first slide for today. And that is that I don't know if people realize the extra credit options. I don't think anybody's done all of them. And of course, some of you may not need extra credit or have any reason or interest in doing them. That deadline I extend because it's easier to log in extra credit up until the Friday of final, or Saturday actually, because the last day of final exams week is a week from this coming Saturday. Let me do the math. That's the 17th. So midnight, I'll send you 2 more emails reminding you, one this week about extra credit options. But if you don't get to them until after the exam, you still have until the midnight on that Saturday, the 17th. I'll remind people after the test. Okay, I think I've covered all the major announcements, but of course we are, remember, going to discuss in detail how the final exam is being given. And I think 1 or 2 people joined us a little late. It's the exact same format as what the first midterm was, not NESE format. And we'll discuss all of that and review for it on Wednesday. Okay, let's see. Is there anybody here who, no, I think we got it. All right, so let me get to the first slide. There's going to be some interesting artists here who are firsts in either categories of, well, gender or race or ethnicity that had not been recognized for many years before they were able to participate in the broader art world, we call it. And that includes the very first one. Here we go. This is the first must-know slide. Pretty important. I'm not saying for sure I will or won't cut it. We'll see as we do the review on Wednesday. But this is certainly an artist that you should all know about when it comes to 20th century painting. So here's today's first must know. The artist's last name is O'Keeffe. Her first name was Georgia. She was a woman who was, by her own proud announcement, so it's no big deal to say, she was bisexual. She had an affair with Frida Kahlo. I think I mentioned that last week, among other people. And she was married to Stieglitz, the famous American photographer that we talked about last week. So again, her last name is O''K''E'Effe, O'Keeffe. Black Iris 3, Roman numeral 3 is how they usually list them. Black Iris, of course, it's a flower that you're looking at here. IRIS, Black Iris 3, 1926. So first thing to say about her, she's the first famous American female artist in America. You got to write it that way if it's on the exam. I'd say it will be, because the first famous female American artist, right, was Mary Cassatt, but she wasn't famous in America till near the end of her career. Finally, she got some recognition, but she still wasn't even a household name. But this woman was during her lifetime in America. So I'll say it again. That the first fact about her is she was the first famous American female painter. Just say painter, because if you say artist, that would include, of course, architecture and photography. So I'll say it again. First famous female American painter in America. The first one to become famous within the United States. She was a household name. She was on the cover of Life and Time magazine, and very well-known artist. Okay, so why? Well, there are 2 reasons. First of all, she developed, these are signature motifs, so it's always part of the meaning of how she painted, what she painted and how she painted it. She had close-up techniques of showing extreme close-ups, which if you look here, you can see that, right? There's let's get this out of there, an extreme close-up of this iris, including the reproductive organs. And yes, there are people who said at the time, and still some critics say, though she denied it, that these were meant to symbolize the female genitalia. I don't have any, opinion on that, because I never, read an interview with her that she admitted or acknowledged, let's say, I'm sorry, is the right word, that is the case. In fact, if anything, I've read that she didn't She said, no, that's not what I intended. If you see that, that's fine. The viewer sees what they want. In other words, her signature motif is to create very strong, realistic detail at such close up, in such close up composition that it became abstract. That's brilliant. She's doing a sort of a blend, if you want to say, well, blend isn't the right word, a combination. There we go. A combination of a hyper realism. We'll talk about that when we get to all the formal elements, and thereby cutting to such, here's her phrase, closely cropped compositions. That's one of her signature motifs. It's a phrase you should probably just use in your notes as I made this point. That's the way to summarize it. Closely cropped compositions are her forte. They're her strength. They are one of her two signature motifs. Closely cropped compositions are so closely framed, if you want to look at it that way, that they become abstract. I mean, you could see all kinds of things in this. If you didn't know from the title that it was a flower, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that. And yet it is very accurate reproduction, a very closely cropped composition or image of the reproductive sections of a black iris. So she had, that's one signature motif. Another was, for she did that with flowers mostly, but the other signature motif is her landscapes. Her landscapes were not closely cropped compositions, but they had an almost abstract quality to them. And we don't have time to do more than one slide of hers in the last few hour and a half that we have of this section of this topic. I'll just say that she did landscape paintings when she moved to New Mexico. This is part of the meaning, who she was. She moved to New Mexico after divorcing her husband, after divorcing Stieglitz. I already spelled his name last week. I'll spell it again, Stieglitz. He was the most famous American photographer in his lifetime. Later on, there were other more famous ones, but he was well known, and he became her second husband. Actually, they both were married to other people when they met, divorced them and married. They were married 30 years, and he helped her career, but he himself said, I didn't help make her. She was already talented. I just gave some, encouragement to her. And because, of course, the fact that he was famous, it probably helped get her work in major museums all over the United States. Her paintings are in almost every major city museum, which he helped with, but it wasn't because of that. She had the talent before she met him. So they were married 30 years, then she divorced him and moved to New Mexico. And so the last part of this, the meaning of who she was, is that she then switched to painting mostly landscapes of the Southwest. Of course, that's where New Mexico is. And those were, mountain ranges and skulls, of dead animals, of course, and various kinds of vistas, views across the desert or mountains of New Mexico where she lived.
Excuse me.
Yes, please. Yes,
wasn't she in Paris, in France, around the time that Picasso and all of those other painters were in those little
I think you're right. I think before
she knew them all, didn't she?
Yeah, before she met Stieglitz, she had worked or studied in Paris and worked both. We're talking about, let's see, she lived to be nearly 100, which I think is fascinating.
Me too.
And she was active toward the end. She started to lose her eyesight. That happens to a lot of famous painters. But after all, she had 95 plus years of good, productive, happy life. She was a remarkable person. Yeah, I saw a documentary interview with her when I was, in like grade school.
Because I saw some photographs where she's, Picasso is right. They're standing next to one another.
Well, he knew she was. Yes, you could say it that way if you want. In other words, she was famous enough to be known by other famous painters
in those circles.
Right, in the highest level of painting. Yeah, of 20th century painting. Absolutely. Okay, so let's do a formal analysis, and then I'll tell you an anecdote. I'll keep it to 2 minutes. That it's almost hard to believe that happened to my mother about George O'Keeffe. No one else would ever be able to tell you, and I witnessed it, so I'll tell you. But let's do the formal analysis, and then you have all the notes on this slide. It is soft but realistic modeling, right? Look at the details. Soft, that's another signature motif of hers. So she really had three. So soft but realistic modeling on all of her closely cropped compositions, especially of flowers. They're almost all were flowers. Occasionally she'd do a piece of fruit or something different. In her earlier years, she focused mostly on flowers. So soft but realistic modeling. And again, soft but realistic cemented textures on the different petals, of course. Totally dynamic. I don't see a straight line in it. And I don't think most flowers have straight lines. In any case, her paintings, I've never seen one that wasn't totally dynamic. Very carefully balanced, brilliantly so, right? With the reproductive section right in the middle and the petals equally above and below. It's very carefully balanced. Of course, the rhythm is the petals themselves, various parts. Here, there is no line as outlined. It might look like it, but look carefully. It's just the modeling and colors side by side, the darker and lighter colors. So there's no outline here. The colors almost on this one, it's mostly cool with, well, of course, the black section here would be neutral, of course, this bottom portion. But the rest of it is purples and shades of darker and lighter blue or whitish and white, bluish white. Those are all cool colors. There's only a hint of the warm color, and if you consider that purple warm. Her flowers were sometimes mixed. Depends on the real flower she was painting, whether they were warm or cool colors. So this one's mostly cool. Okay, and then we have the largest mass. It's a single mass. I mean, you could break it down, but that's arbitrary into sections. But the way she painted it's a single item. For space, there's only overlapping. There's no setting of this in space. She deliberately did not want to convey, like say a still life that she might have created for painting this, or a vase or any kind of setting. So there is no setting in real space here. Is only the technique, of course, of overlapping. There's no distortion or altering of proportions either on this. Okay. I think that's everything. But here's a quick anecdote. My mother wrote a letter when we moved to California from Chicago. My mother was a painter. She never made much money. She sold maybe half a dozen paintings her whole life, but she wasn't doing it for the money. But she considered one of her inspirations, if not a heroine of hers personally, to be, of course, George O'Keeffe. So she wrote a letter addressed to her at the studio, which was not a secret where George O'Keeffe lived, but she was a very secretive person toward the end of her life. This is when she was already in her late 80s, I would think. I'm talking about George O'Keeffe, not my mother. So we all got in a Rambler station wagon and drove across the United States. And when we got to Mexico, near where George O'Keeffe's ranch was 50 miles off of Highway 66. Yes, we took Route 66, the famous Route 66, all the way across America. From Chicago to LA. My mother said, stop, turn here. And my dad said, why? Because I wrote a letter to George O'Keeffe and she didn't answer, and I wanted to know why. So we drove 100 miles to do the round trip, right? 50 miles in each direction, out of our way, so my mother could do this. We parked outside. She wasn't going to be allowed to get into the compound. They had a wall around it. Of course, she was world famous. She had security people, but no cameras or anything. This is 1960. Mid 60s. But my mother said, I'm going to find out if she's home. I'm going to ask her if she got my letter. And all we know, me and my brothers, my dad and I was one of four boys. So the five of us in this hot, and it was not air conditioned, this hot New Mexico August, it was, scenery, is watching my mother talk her way past the security gate and into the compound and disappeared for like half an hour. We have no idea, and she would never tell us. Did she ever meet George O'Keeffe? And if so, did they talk? And if so, what did they talk about? She wouldn't say. She said she asked me not to say anything. And we assume that means she met her, but I have no way of knowing. It's a mystery of our family. Very strange. So she may have met George O'Keeffe and talked one artist to another, but we'll never know.
Did she take it to her grave?
Yes, literally.
Ooh.
Yeah, one of those family stories. Yeah, here we go. Oh, I love this painting. And now this one, some of you must be familiar with because it's been reproduced in all kinds of variations. Some of them obscene, some of them comical, some of them Disney-esque. In fact, Walt Disney sued the person that did that with the Disney characters sitting around the counters here. But the original is what we're looking at, one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century. Hopper, the artist, my dad's favorite artist, Hopper, Hopper, Nighthawks, just like it sounds. Everyone knows how to spell that, right? Nighthawks, 1942. Edward Hopper was a social realist who used some impressionist techniques because, just like you were saying, Tanya, about George O'Keeffe, he moved to Paris for several years. I think it was a decade or so to study painting in the early 20th century. And he was inspired by the French Impressionists, of course. He undoubtedly he met a number of them. Now, he wasn't famous that far back, but he did later become famous enough that they would know who he was. He was a early to mid, because he was painting well into the 60s. So early to mid 20th century American social realist, or just say social realist painter, because there were some in Europe and other in Latin America. So what did he do? He was what was his themes? Okay, that's important. This painting is a powerful example of his primary theme, which is the isolation, social isolation and loneliness of urban American life, or 20th century anyway, urban American life. This is like what, 2 a.m. It's an all night, cafe. And we have a couple that may or may not know each other before they sat down at the counter, and a guy who's all by himself, and the soda jerk, that's what they call back then, right behind the counter, who's there to serve them, and no one on the streets. It's obviously the early morning or wee hours, however you want to write that, like 2 a.m. in the morning. And most people think it's set in New York, but it could be any big American city. Now, he lived in various parts of the eastern seaboard. He moved around. He was actually from, I think, New England. So I know he lived, let's just say, he lived in the greater Boston area, and then he lived in New York. He painted scenes in the countryside as well, but his focus, his primary themes, most of his famous paintings are about, again, I'll say it, the alienation and loneliness of 20th century American urban life. He captured it brilliantly, of course. These people have nowhere else to go, right, at this point, and they're denizens of the night. Now, if you don't know this already, the Art Institute of Chicago owns this painting, and it has a wall. Well, it did the last time I was there. They could have moved it all to itself because it's such an iconic painting. It's been reproduced. You could write that's part of the meeting in various humorous and satirical versions. One is Street of Broken Dreams with Elvis Presley and James Dean and Marilyn Monroe, I think it is, sitting at the counter. Another is Disney characters, which caused a lawsuit for the artist, whoever produced it, and the publisher of that print. It was on the wall of my dorm when I was there for a while. One of my fellow dorm mates had it.
Was
And
it
then there was,
Jessica?
pardon? What?
Was it Jessica they put in the corner? Walt
Uh,
Disney?
uh, I'm guessing. I don't know. I
The
can't remember. I think it's
voluptuous.
before. No, it's before that. It could be. It was in the 70s. That movie didn't come out until the 80s or 90s. Anyway, the point is various Disney characters were used, and then some that were obscene, which I wouldn't try to describe to you. So it's become so famous an image of American urban life or nightlife. You see, nightlife implies, hey, party. No way, this is not a party. These people aren't happy. These people are not celebrating. They're not going out to be with other people. They're lonely and they have nowhere else to go but this neighborhood coffee shop that's open all night. So it captures the alienation and loneliness of urban American life. Now, here are the last thing about the meaning is his signature motif is a mixture of realism. That whole area within the glass, right, walls of and everything inside the coffee shop is realistic. But look at the sidewalk, right? And look at the street. And even look at the windows across the street. There is clearly some impressionistic detailing here, which he almost always did do that. Combine certain areas of impressionism with mostly sharp realism. So he was a social realist, but with an impressionist influence. Makes him almost unique. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole meaning on this one. What do we say about the formal elements? Well, for space, here it's realistic. See, he's a social realist, so he's going to have, definitely there is a vanishing point. It has scientific perspective. It would be well behind the buildings across the street, of course. No question there's foreshortening and obviously overlapping, and there is diminishing size. This building is smaller than the one we're looking right at. closest to us. So there's diminishing size for shortening, overlapping, and scientific perspective. There wouldn't be atmospheric perspective. It's a night view. All the detailing on the main section of the painting within the coffee shop, the focus of the painting is super sharp and realistic on the human beings, the countertop, the windows, but it's soft and diffused on the buildings across the street and on the street and the sidewalk. So there's both realistic or sharp simulated textures and modeling on the people and objects in the foreground, and soft but diffuse modeling and simulated texture on all the objects in the middle and distance. Okay, now is there line? Yes, there is some line around the realistic sections here, mostly around the framing of the windows in the coffee shop, but I would say there's some on the countertop too. Is there line here? Yes, but it's more a function of the, because it's soft and impressionistic, of the colors alternating, or side by side. The effect of colors create almost visual line, but there is an outline on the background, just on the foreground. There's no distortion of proportion or alteration of scale. And the largest mass, well, I'd call it the coffee shop, is a single mass. To me, that's the largest mass. And then it's a close call between the sidewalk and the building across the street. Probably the building across the street is slightly larger than the sidewalk. The colors, of course, are like you would expect, mixtures of warm on her dress and the yellow door, cool on the two blue chutes and the white jacket of the soda jerk, and of course warm on the counter, cool on the window framing, and warm on the building across the street on the upper floor. Yeah, you see the alternating warm and cool colors throughout. He almost always did that. Here the rhythm is obvious with the bar stools, the human bodies of the four people inside the shop, the windows across the street. There's a lot of rhythm. It is mostly stable, though it feels dynamic because this is a curved, typical Art Deco probably this is a soda shop that was around 10-15 years before the painting. So, that's Art Deco era, 30s, most likely. It would have had a rounded glass corner. Some buildings still do have those, and even new ones sometimes. That's a very 30s type thing. So that creates, as you can see here, dynamic line, but overall it's stable because all of the framing, the people are sitting upright except for the soda jerk leaning over. The counters, right, and the building is totally stable, the one across the street. So it's mostly stable. Okay, the largest mass would be the coffee shop. I think I already mentioned that. That's right. And let's see, am I missing something? Texture, modeling, line, balance. Oh, yes. Is it balanced? I think so, because this guy's right about in the middle, and he's the one most lonely because he's totally isolated over the far end of the counter. And I think he wants us to look at him first. Hopper wants us to notice him. So around him, though, if you add, the space is pretty well, and he's at the top of his head anyway, is roughly halfway from bottom to the top of the painting frame. So it's roughly balanced both ways, I would say. Although the rhythm of these people might make you think of it as more weighted towards the right. I don't think so when you add the windows here and the framing of these. It's roughly balanced both ways. Okay, moving on to one of my favorite artists here, okay, of the 20th century painters that we covered, Lawrence, Jacob Lawrence, Lawrence. Okay, and this is Tombstones, one word, just like it sounds, Tombstones, 1942. I'm just double checking because I know, yeah, good. I know it's recording, but sometimes I get a little nervous. I'm not sure it's recording. Let's start out with who was Jacob Lawrence. He was the most famous African-American painter during his career until late in his life, when many others got the opportunity. And the reason that happened, the reason became nationally, I mean, my parents collected prints of his work when I was growing up in Chicago, is because of, well, you'd almost have to say Eleanor Roosevelt, but anyway, the Roosevelts, both Franklin and Eleanor, the president and first lady, they admired his work even before he was elected president. And he, that is, but with Ella, we know now it was Eleanor's, his wife's recommendation, invited Jacob Lawrence to the White House at the beginning of the New Deal. And it's all part of the meaning now. The New Deal, I hope you know what that was. It was a pretty important part of American history, which helped tens of millions of people during the Great Depression. One of the projects was arts and performing and visual arts, supporting artists who were quite literally starving. I mean, no, that phrase almost a cliche, but literally were starving during the Depression. And so Jacob Lawrence had already had a career as a painter in Harlem, is where he lived when he was, becoming famous. But he wasn't known that well outside of, well, certainly not outside the East Coast. But by being invited to the White House, he was given a commission to paint a series of paintings on the history of Black America. It's a fascinating series, and you can go see it anywhere, I'm sure, on a good website that covers 20th century American painting. And this is part of that series. And it would be Harlem, where he lived, and all of the different aspects of life in Harlem. And when the title, of course, it's right there in the middle of this painting. So if it's on the exam, you've got no excuse for not getting the title right. Okay, is that this shop selling tombstones is symbolic of the high rate of death, disease, poverty, and of course, suffering and depression that often happens in any segregated ghetto community like Harlem was. And yet there's all kinds of life happening despite that around those tombstones. Here's a mother with a baby, and then this looks like this man may be coming to visit. It's hard to tell if this baby carriage is the father. I mean, is of that baby, or is she the baby? We don't know if it's a boy or girl. One of the children of the woman in red. In any case, it's ironic, and it's meant to be, because the little kid in the baby carriage is reaching for a white doll. There were black dolls then, that far back, but not that many. It was harder to find. So it's a comment on, of course, the way race relations were in the 1940s. And then these stairs here lead up to a building full of life. Here's a minister, probably, boy, he's dressed. Here's a woman who probably knows him. They're having for sure, these two are having a conversation about, what's happening in the neighborhood, or events at the church, or fundraising, to try and help people. Remember, the Great Depression lasted well into the 40s. World War II helped put it to an end. And then the building boom of the World War II, after World War II, of course, brought the longest period of prosperity in American history, but that was years away. And this is a ghetto, obviously. So the effects of racism, segregation, poverty, and of course, unfortunately, disease and things that go with that, leading to higher death rates in a neighborhood like Harlem, is what he's commenting on here in this particular view. These would be many of them, not maybe everyone, but in certainly his neighborhood, he knew people that had moved from the South to get away from Jim Crow and the overt racism of that system in the South, and at least have some chance. They were hoping for a better life when they got to big cities in the North. But he's saying once they got there, it wasn't necessarily the dream they had about a better life. It was still
Slum tenements.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. But I want to comment on this. This is what I think is what makes, when I admire an artist like Matisse did this, and Alexander Calder did this, and all kinds of other artists have, this guy gave back in ways that very few did. When he became famous due to a combination of magazine, he was in Life magazine, he was featured then during the time that the two Roosevelts will say, the White House, had sponsored him as an artist on, it's called the WPA. You don't have to know that term, but it was a great initiative. It's what kept a lot of the arts alive during the Depression. When it was hard enough to find any kind of job, let alone as an artist. But the government stepped up and said, the arts are important. Visual arts, all kinds, photography. Gordon Parks, one of the greatest photographers of the 20th century, African-American, he lived to be nearly 100, one of my heroes, one of my parents' heroes. He also was sponsored by the WPA, and they would have known each other, Lawrence and Gordon Parks. I wish we had time to go into his photography, but we don't. You can still do something for extra credit, by the way. There's a documentary about Gordon Parks, and I can't remember what the Giving Tree, I think it's called. He wrote a children's book by that time. So there were a lot of artists of all kinds of backgrounds, artists of color, what formerly successful, but now hungry, maybe middle class or even upper class artists from different backgrounds. Native American artists, it was a very relative compared to the times. The WPA, it was a Work Progress Administration. If you want to write that, that's the title for this program, which had a subcategory for the arts. And that's what Jacob Lawrence was working with, that program. But he was already well established. And afterwards, he went on to become even more famous. But here's the last thing about the meaning of who he was. I said he gave back. How? He established a scholarship program for inner city kids all over the United States to be able to teach art and to help them get some kind of work in like graphic art, commercial art, something that would actually, pay a living in big cities. That wasn't a government program. That was him doing that. Now, he sometimes got, matching funds from well-to-do citizens of those cities or even the local government, but it was his idea to create these inner city youth programs for young artists in urban areas all over the United States. It was started in New York, but it expanded to other cities. That's called giving back, right? That's what a humanitarian does, right? And he was definitely a humanitarian. Yeah, he lived to be, I think, well into his late 80s or early 90s. He was still painting when I was a kid. I remember that. Okay, so there's a lot of meaning to this. Formal analysis. I love the colors here. Look at this deep, rich, this I would call it more of a warm purple, right? Compared to, more bluish purple. And of course, the clothing is a variety of, neutral on the minister's black clothes, warm on the yellow of this woman's dress and these two women's red or reddish orange dresses. And then the curtains here, and of course, these flowers. And then cool on the stairs and the background, I guess it would be reflecting the sky, right? The windows, bluish and off-white colors, of course, are cool. There is bold outline here, but it's not as obvious. It's not as prevalent as it could be on some other. This is social realism, by the way. There's no question that's what this cat, if you had to categorize his style, it's social realism. I should have mentioned it earlier. You see the bold outline on the stairs, and you see it around the tombstones here. And then thin outline on the human figures. There is limited modeling just on the stairs. That's the only place I see it. And maybe the windows, if you consider that to be clouds, but it's hard to say, reflected. This is a daytime view, I have to assume, in the glass of the doorway and some of the windows. It's hard to say if that's true, but then this window must be open, see, so I'm not sure that that's supposed to be clouds. You could say that's a kind of modeling, but mostly it's limited to the staircase. Otherwise, there's little or no modeling anywhere else. And there's only implied simulated textures. He had that as one of his signature motifs. He didn't go into detail of simulated textures, except on portraits. Some portraits of famous African-American and other people that he painted, he would use simulated texture. But on these kind of group scenes, he didn't. And then we have for space, we have overlapping. And I think you could say diminishing size, because these three residents in the windows here, or door and windows, are smaller than these two, the man and the woman at the bottom are closer to us. So there is diminishing size and overlapping, but I don't see foreshortening. He didn't feel the need to use that. The largest mass, well, the wall of the building, then the staircase, I guess. And then I think it'd be the woman in red, or possibly the minister. They're almost equal masses. Is it balanced? I think so, but there is empty space here, but then there's some here. However, this is wider. So I do think a lot of people would see this as having a slight imbalance toward the left. And certainly it's unbalanced toward the bottom, because he wants us to focus on the whole thing where the title of the painting is, in the scene that he's wants us to notice most of all the tombstones that will unfortunately be needed by some of the families in this neighborhood. And then we have, let's see, is there distortion of proportion? I don't think so. I don't see it, or scale. This woman sitting down, if she were standing up, she'd probably be, not a tall, but a normal height adult female compared to the minister. So I don't think there's any distortion of proportions, or, well, yeah, you could say there is on how skinny the woman at the top of the stairs. Whoops, sorry, let me get that. Her arms are, yeah. So there is slight distortion on it. But then that also could be him making a comment on how hungry the people are. Not this woman's though. So there is some difference, and I would say that's the only example then of the two women in the upper left corners have slightly altered skinny, skinnier than normal arms as compared to the other human figures, all the others. Okay, and then let's see. I already mentioned the rhythm, I think, right? The human bodies, the stairs, the tombstones, the windows. Lots of rhythm. Okay, let's move on to here. Hang on, I need to take a. I'm trying to decide how far to go because I want to still do a couple more on. Yeah, let's do this. Let's do at least two more because there's a lot to say about the next two. Like there has been about all of these artists. These are all artists whose work you could find in almost, including the Museum of Modern Art. I'm finally going to go there in December, right after final exams. Actually, it's a birthday present from a friend to see the Diego Rivera exhibit. That would be if you wait till the week after the final exams, which the deadline, I just said it, but some people joined us late, is for all extra credit is midnight Saturday, December 17th, which is the last day of finals. So if you go to any museum and send me a screenshot of the ticket, right, that has the time and date and the name of the museum, you'll get 10 points. And you still have time to do that if you haven't, or if you've done it once, you can do it another museum. Okay, this guy's work is represented in almost every major modern museum. MoMA means Museum of Modern Art. If that's not obvious, every big city has one that I know of. What does that mean? Yeah, city over 1 million anyway. The metro area. Okay. Clearly there's one in LA, there's one in Seattle, there's one in, I don't know about Portland, frankly, but I know there is, obviously we know there's in the Bay Area, at New York, Chicago, Detroit, Boston. There are museums of modern art all over the country. And they started in the 30s, by the way, in New York. So MoMA is just the abbreviation for Museum of Modern Art in any given city. So the San Francisco, or SF MoMA, has one of the earliest paintings by this guy. So here's our next artist. Now this one is one I'm definitely not cutting from the study list. Okay, it's very important in that regard. So let's see, what are we looking at? The artist's name is Pollock, 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 and the title is Autumn Rhythm number 30. Autumn, I think everyone knows, is AUTUMN. Rhythm, don't forget that's with an H, rhythm, which you all know from the 10 elements of composition. Autumn Rhythm number 30. And here he uses the actual, normal number 30, not Roman numerals. The date is 1950. So who was Jackson Pollock? Well, there's a lot to say about him, but I'm just going to hit the highlights, and you want to get good notes and study this one because there's a high possibility of being on the final. Oh, by the way, also Nighthawks is one that I also would say is a high possibility. We already covered it, of course, by Edward Hopper. Any of the others could be, of course, that we're covering today and Wednesday. Okay, so who is Jackson Pollock? He's the first American painter to have his work sold for over $500,000 during his lifetime. I think it was the last year he was alive, but that's a phenomenon. Today, that's nothing. In these auctions, tens of millions of dollars are spent for one painting. It's almost obscene, right? Well, depending on your point of view, I mean, it's crazy, right? That's what rich collectors of paintings will pay in an art auction if it's a really famous artist. Well, I'll say it again, Jackson, his first name was Jackson Pollock, was the first American painter to have any of his paintings sell for over $500,000 during his lifetime. That's a pretty major, benchmark. Another thing is that he's credited with inventing the drip style of abstract painting. So what style is this? Well, we just, to be safe, because that drip, that's not very, what's the descriptive term, I'll tell you what that means in a minute. So here's what you should write now. The last new definition for this whole semester, it's on your list at the bottom of your list of terms to know, is abstract expressionism. So he is credited with being, you can't say the first, but one of the first abstract expressionists, and no question the most famous American abstract expressionist. People might debate that and argue with it because a lot of famous ones have come since he died. He died young, well, in his early 50s, pretty young. And I'll tell you how he died. It was totally tragic. But that's when we finish with the meaning. So I'll repeat this phrase, this fact about him. I mean, he was one of the first famous abstract expressionists in America, and he became the most famous abstract expressionist. So here we go. What does that mean? Abstract expressionism, I'll say it slowly and repeat it, the definition, is a movement of 20th century painting, okay, a movement of 20th century painting in which artists in which artists, plural of course, gave free rein to expressing their inner thoughts and emotions on the canvas, period. Okay, now I assume not everyone got that, so I'll repeat it again slowly. Abstract expressionism is a movement of 20th century painting in which artists gave free rein to their expression of their inner thoughts and feelings on the canvas. So it supposedly, period, okay, meant they weren't trying to portray reality. It had nothing to do with real life or real objects. It had to do with their inner thoughts and feelings. And yes, if you can guess, usually it had to do with anxiety, depression, angst, all of the negative emotions that someone might feel expressed on the canvas. That's exactly what we're looking at here. This is by a man who, by the time he painted this, he was a household name. He was on the cover of Life magazine. You can't imagine how important that magazine was. It was in every home I ever saw that had any kind of magazines or books anyway, all the time I was growing up. It was the largest circulation English language publication in the world. It had tens of millions of subscribers back when America had less than half the population we have now. It was remarkably influential. It came out every week. And certainly almost all middle class and obviously upper class and even many working class families subscribed to it. He was on the cover of that magazine, Life magazine, several times during his lifetime because he was so famous. He was a chronic depression. It's all part of what the meaning of this painting is, who he was and what he's expressing here, what feeling. He was a chronic depressive. That means he wasn't born with a depression illness. He wasn't bipolar or schizophrenic, but he was chronically depressed throughout almost his entire career. And it shows in his work that he was expressing what thoughts and feelings? Anxiety, depression, or even anger and resentment about various things in his life. And he was a hardcore alcoholic. That probably is what gave rise. Well, no, it's probably the other way around. The chronic depression probably gave rise to the alcoholism. Anyway, he was never able to break free. He tried to go, clean and sober, and he could never do it. So he was almost his entire career. He was a hardcore, and that's a strong phrase to use. I mean, not he didn't just drink a little bit; he drank too much. There is a movie, and you could get extra credit for it, but I got to warn you, it's not an upbeat movie, but it's a masterpiece. It won several awards, I think Academy Awards, called Pollock, just his last name, and it's a reenactment of his, life from the time he started getting some recognition as a painter until his death. And why am I forgetting? I can see his face. The guy, maybe Tanya, the guy that played him in that movie. Yeah, I can see.
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember
the name.
the
Well,
name of
it's
the
just the
actor.
only movie with that title. Now there might be documentaries, so that would give you 10 points too. Remember, if you just write 2 pages of just your own opinion, no grading for spelling or grammar, about what you learned from a movie or a documentary. So that movie is a Hollywood Ed. Wow, I'm not gonna remember his last name. Ed Harris. Yes, Ed Harris. Oh, he knocked the ball out of the park. People who knew Jackson Pollock, there's still people alive who knew him. He died in the late 50s, including his, I think his widow was still alive when that movie was made, which is about 15 years ago.
I
Yeah,
think I may have seen part of it.
they captured what he was really like. Impossible to
Mm.
live with. That's why she divorced him. Was she his widow if they were divorced? Well, technically, whatever. Just say that she survived him by many years, and she was an abstract expressionist herself. Some say she's the one that gave him the idea for this style. So there's a controversy there that's part of the meaning. There are many historians who believe that he was riffing off of her early examples of the same type of painting, but he did take it to another level, any way you want to look at it, and that is he called it the drip style. He would stand on platforms, wooden platforms, in his studio, which was a huge barn in upstate New York. I'll say it slowly, it's part of the meaning. How did he create these paintings? These were huge. They were many
Mhm.
feet across,
That's
right?
right.
Right. Some of them as big as a whole room. And he would
Mm.
build these wooden platforms and walk around. Not all his paintings he did this way, but the drip ones he did. And he'd take his paintbrush or a stick, a wooden stick, sometimes both, one after the other, of course, dip them into different colors of paint, and then dribble the paint on the canvas. Now, there are people who consider that not high or fine art, but you can say what you want. This,
But there are people love these.
yes, it appealed to a large segment of the public and to art critics all over the US. And that's how he became famous, and his paintings started selling for more and more money. And you had thought the success would give him less anxiety and more happiness.
Mm-mm.
Here's the last part about the meaning, and it's the saddest thing in the
Do you
movie.
think, excuse me,
Yes, go ahead. Sure.
do you think that maybe he was bipolar and he was self-medicating and didn't want to
Well,
take the
there's no
medication?
evidence. I mean, that makes some this, it's a logical guess, but from everything I've read, the people that knew him, including his former wife, and therefore, I guess, widow, and his own critic and manager, all these people that worked and lived with him and knew him,
Mhm.
family members, even, siblings, they said no, he wasn't ever diagnosed with anything like that.
Oh,
And so he was just chronically
because
depressed.
alcohol can lower
Yeah,
serotonin levels.
right. Yes. Yeah, the alcohol, I think the two fed off
And
each
people
other.
that are bipolar, I've from my medical classes, some for some strange reason have lower levels of melatonin.
Yeah, yeah, I've read that quite often. I've had one, two
I
family
bet you he
members
just
that
didn't go
had.
to the doctor about it. I bet he
Yeah, who
was.
knows? In any case, what we do know is he was chronically depressed and he was a severe alcoholic. Last thing about him, and then we'll do a formal analysis, is that here's how he died. His wife had left him, divorced him already. In fact, not just left him. And he had, a girlfriend, living with a girlfriend after their breakup. And one day he was rip roaring. It's in broad daylight. This last scene of the movie. Pollock illustrates this tragic ending to his life and career. He took two people with him. Literally, he shoved and pushed these two young women. One was his girlfriend, and the other was her best friend, into the back seat of his convertible. There were no seat belts. This is the late 50s. And he hit the gas and was going well over 80, some say 90 miles an hour, when he hit a tree. He plowed deliberately. I mean, what explanation? There was no, road conditions. There was no other traffic. There was no rain, broad daylight. I believe it was in the summer. Anyway, he ran right into a tree and instantly killed himself and his girlfriend. I think she was sitting next to him, and then I believe just permanently crippled the woman in the back. So she may have survived, but her life was ruined by his act of suicide. Too bad he didn't just take himself out. Always happens that way. It's a tragic ending to his life, and sadly kind of indicative of what his mental state was like his whole adult life, despite his success, his wealth, and his fame. So success doesn't make everybody happy, obviously. Some people just, nothing seems to work. Okay, so let's wrap it up with a formal analysis, and then we have one more must know, and then I'll take questions at the end, of course. All right, this is, people can criticize it, and it isn't my favorite style painting, but I've grown to appreciate it much more over the 25 plus years I've been teaching and showing this same slide, because one of his most famous paintings. And that is that it is balanced. Look carefully. It's not an accident that the thicker lines of the drip, of black paint match or balance, I should say match, balance well with the ones over here. And then in the middle, you've got this, it's not an accident. He gave some thought to, even though he did not compose it carefully like any other realistic style painting would ever have done. So he didn't just slather paint mindlessly, is what I'm saying. He gave it some thought, but he was expressing his inner thoughts, and you would say demons even, his depression and his anxiety on the canvas. The other thing is he would take sticks and slap the sticks, and I think that's how he did these. There we go, these here. So is there a line? Yes, but not as outlined. Of course there's a line created by the dark brown or black, I guess it is black paint dripping here. So there's line. And obviously it's dynamic. There isn't a straight line in it. It's totally dynamic. There's no technique for space, but there is real overlapping of the colors of the dark brown, the black, and the white overlapping each other, because he didn't do them all in one day. He'd let the first layer of drippings dry and then go back another day and do another color. So there is
That makes better sense.
yeah, well, it does have real overlapping, but it's not a technique for space, is what I'm saying. So it's, you have to write it that way. Yeah, again, if this is on, and it has a possibility of being on the essay part, finally you'd want to write it that way. So yes, overlapping exists in the paint itself, but it is not a technique for space. There is no space techniques. He's not concerned with space. Is there a larger and smaller mass? I don't see it. It's all pretty much so intertwined that it's a one single loose mass, you could say it that way. I already said it's very carefully balanced. The rhythm, well, the title does is that, obviously repeated uses of these kind of thin and bold lines. So there is some bold and thin, I should have mentioned, but not as outlined, just actual lines of paint on the canvas. It is mostly warm and neutral. There's some cool here, but the warm dominates because the background is a kind of a light tan, and then the darker brown colors, of course, is some of the, so it's neutral. It's a mixture of neutral and of course some cool, but mostly warm color. The majority, if you squint, is very shades of brown. That makes it predominantly a warm canvas. There's no distortion of proportion or alteration of scale here because he's not trying to reproduce anything. There is no simulated texture. There is just the real texture of the paint on the canvas. No simulated textures, implied or otherwise. And obviously, therefore, nothing realistic in terms of the actual texture of the paint itself, of course, would be smooth, but that's not technique. He's not concerned with texture, nor is there any modeling, none, zero, none, because he's not, again, trying to portray or convey reality here. Okay.
It reminds me of cookies and cream.
Yeah, it does.
Oreo cookies and cream. Because I
was
did this one time too, some Oreos,
I
and put
was
them on a
thinking-
cake.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking that the colors do look like cookies. Yeah, I think that's what. Okay, now we get to one of my favorite abstract expressionist artists, but he's one of those who had his own niche, and it's our last must know for today. So again, if you go down the syllabus, okay, we've already covered Pollock, and then we'll do. Actually, I think we have time for two more. Yes, we do. Rothko, Rothko, Rothko. Orange and yellow. Orange and yellow, that's the title, just the two main colors. 1956. Rothko was the most famous color field painter of all time. No one, like the Russians did that back during the revolution. Over 100 years ago, there were color field painters in this early Soviet Union. So it didn't start in America. A lot of people think it started with either Rothko or someone of that generation here. No, it started in Europe. But he became, Rothko, his first name was Mark, the most famous color field painter. And what does that mean? Well, it's a type of abstract painting which consists solely of different blocks of color juxtaposed. Literally, it's just a kind of abstract painting which is solely composed of different blocks or blocks of different colors juxtaposed. And they are juxtaposed here in a unique way because he did one more thing that other color painters hadn't thought of. He blended the colors in some of the area where they touch, or nearly, where the borders are. The edges, I should say. There's no real borders, I should say edges. Where the edges of the orange meet the lower upper edges of the lower edges of the yellow, they blend here. He did that quite often. But the main thing is the colors were symbolic of his moods. And now here I can tell you, based on what we were just talking about, right, about Pollock, he was bipolar. And he was probably rapid cycling, but in any case, he was intensely bipolar, and he was diagnosed with it. And he did have to take, they didn't have very good medications back in the 50s and 60s, but he did take some medication and tried to deal with it, as well as he could. And this was when he was in an, should be obvious, the colors are warm. So we'll do the formal elements in just a minute, an upbeat or positive state of mind in which he was feeling, optimistic. And when he was feeling more downbeat, go to MoMA in San Francisco, you'll see those. Later in his life and his career, he started using darker and more depressing colors. And there's at least, I think, 3 of his paintings, I think it is, at MoMA in San Francisco, and they're all dark, and the colors are not upbeat or optimistic. They don't engender a positive, sunshiny, state of mind. Whereas when he did this, he was at the height of his fame and success. Even then, though, he had, with manic depression, if you know anything about it, you don't just go through years without any depression. You usually go back and forth between ups and downs every few days, but certainly
Manic.
every few weeks. Yeah, it depends on what level of it you have or what form.
Mhm.
And here's the last thing about him. After he became world famous and his paintings were displayed in museums all over the world, and large paintings of his were displayed in public buildings, mostly in New York City, where he lived. Some of them still on display in famous restaurants or hotels and things. He committed suicide. He had a retrospective. This is the last fact about who he was. And he was going to get at I think it was the Museum of Modern Art in New York, just say one of the main museums. Could have been the Met. Anyway, just say a major museum in New York was going to do a retrospective of his whole life, his whole career. I mean, of course. And he didn't live to see it, because as he was producing a couple of new paintings in his studio for that, he had obviously he was a victim of a severe depression, and he ended up committing suicide. I forget how, poison, I think, or sleeping pills. In any case, he took his own life. And that's how he was found, dead in his own studio, just before this new exhibit of his life's work was going to open. Rather tragic again. Ending. At least he didn't take anybody else with him. So this is in his earlier phase. I mean, he was already well known when he did this, but in his more optimistic phase of his state of mind, as well as in his career. I love this kind of stuff. It's to me, it speaks volumes about what he was trying to convey, which is the inner, deeper feelings, almost subconsciously, that we all have in our positive and negative, optimistic and depressive. And he tried to convey, when he could, of course, feel that positive with the colors, the choice of colors, and he succeeded here. Okay, of course, this is all warm. There's no line as outline. There is no modeling. There's no simulated texture. There's only the real texture of the paint on canvas. Okay, and the largest mass is the orange patch, and then the yellow, and then the border around, of course, which varies slightly, but it's mostly a salmon color, right? And then we have balance. I think it is, but you could say because the dominant or largest single section of it is it's a rectangle. Yeah, it is, not quite a square of orange. You could say that dominates, and therefore it's weighted toward the bottom. But I don't see it that way, because if you add the border above and you squint and you take, it's roughly equal from the top of the orange patch to the top of the painting. And then definitely it's balanced left to right. He usually did do that consciously. There's no altered proportion or distortion of things here. And of course, like we said, there's no modeling, no simulated texture. For space, there is no technique for space. None. Zero. There's not even overlapping here, unless you count where they blend. But this doesn't overlap. It's just blending of 2 warm colors at the fringes of each block of color. So there's not even overlapping here. There's, let's see, the rhythm, of course, of the repeated shapes of the 2 main blocks of color. Okay, we have time for one more. I think I covered everything. Texture, modeling, space, balance. Yeah, I think that's it. Okay. This is
Did he
also,
do I'm sorry.
yeah.
Did,
if it's very quick, because I do want to.
Did he do a lavender and mulberry painting like
Oh
that as
yeah,
well?
he did almost
Okay,
hundreds of paintings
okay.
in colors. I'm pretty sure I've seen ones like that. I mean, he would do variations on the same colors too. Okay, this is the last stuff for today. Johns was his last name, just like it sounds with an S. Johns. First name was Jasper. Three Flags, 1958. He was a pop artist. Now I could have added, and let's see, did I even put that on here? No, I didn't. It's not a definition you'll have to write a separate standalone. It might not, in other words, it won't appear on the true false section of the final. However, if this slide is on, I'm not saying it's so important, I might or might not cut it, but for now, assume it could be. So here's why you should write, or how, I'm sorry, how you should write that definition. He was one of the first pop artists, P-O-P, just like it sounds, capital P, right? It's a whole style of 20th century American. Now, it spread around the world, but it started in the US. It's a whole movement of 20th century American painting, which took mass-produced objects from popular culture that took or portrayed, you could say, mass-produced objects from popular culture and reproduced them in paintings to invoke a new perspective on those items. You were supposed to see them in a different way. So how does this? Well, the flag, of course, obviously, it's all over the United States. And of course, it's the 50s, very patriotic period, of course. He was roundly attacked by some groups, conservative mostly, of course, but some of them were just veterans who said, you're insulting the flag by painting the flag as though it's an object of common everyday household type of setting or image. He was a veteran. He fought in, I think it was the Korean War, pretty sure. He was a veteran of overseas. He served his country. He wasn't insulting the flag or belittling it. He was just saying it's a work of art. It has its own composition. It has lines and colors and and shapes. And that's all you see here. So you see, in a way, it's his way of using the flag in the same way that Mondrian did. Remember, last week we covered him. Mondrian was, the guy that was one of the fierce, pure geometric abstract painters with just lines and colors and shapes. Well, here you see colors. Of course, are there really any lines? Not as outlined. We'll do the form analysis in just about 2 minutes. So what happened was this painting got this first. It was in New York because he was a New York-based artist. And there it didn't get too much controversy, but there were pickets even there. And when it toured in other ones of versions, he painted several versions of this painting, toured in other cities, some cities, particularly in, smaller cities in the Midwest. Some of his work was protested very vociferously by various groups in those cities, picketing the museum outside. Why do you have this insult to the American? I mean, it's just amazing. Why would you think this is an insult? But it is true. It portrays the American flag in a different way than you would ever normally see. It's not on a flagpole, of course. It's a series of canvases glued on top of each other. Maybe that's what bothered the critics, because they were using glue to adhere. But they're not real flags. They're different three sizes of canvases. And they glued to each other, and then each one is painted with a different, aspect of the flag. And of course, this one, I think he painted them all complete first. By the way, back then there were only 48 states, if you're curious. Alaska and Hawaii hadn't been parts. That's part of the meaning. This is when there were 48 states. So it's a nice even number crossing down, right? The number of stars, right? If you're curious. So he then would glue those on, and then the whole thing became one large canvas, rather heavy, I'm sure, and it would be mounted on the wall. And he never meant it to be satirical or insulting or disrespectful, but that's how some people saw it. So he became famous because of that controversy, and then he went on to do all kinds of really interesting pop art images that had nothing to do with the flag, many other works of art. He lived until very recently. I think he just died a few years ago. It's about my dad's age, from my dad's generation, World War II generation. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole meaning. We can say that this has the rhythm of the repeated stars and stripes, of course. And it's obviously alternating warm, cool. And then, of course, here you have all cool on the blue and white background of the stars. Is there a distorted proportion? Yes. Here you'd say there is, or altered, not distorted. I wouldn't use that word. I'd say altered proportion, because the largest flag is the one on the bottom, which then has two smaller ones glued to it, and they get successively smaller. So for space, there is the overlapping. That's it, of the actual canvases on top of each other of the three different flags. But there's no technique for space. It's real space. It's full of the rhythm of the stripes, the stars, of course. And then we have no line as outline. There's visual line in that the edges of the blue field for the stars and each line give an impression of, each stripe, I'm sorry, give the impression of lines, but there are no lines. There's no outlines at all. Is it mostly stable or dynamic? Well, the stars by themselves are dynamic, but the square they're in and the stripes are stable, and each overall shape of each flag is stable. So it's mostly stable, though it gives some people the impression of being dynamic because of the way the shapes, get larger the farther away the three flags are from us, the viewer. But technically it's all stable, except for the actual stars themselves. And then let's see, what do we have here for is it balanced? There are more white and red stripes. The area is covered by that. So if you want to look at it that way, you could say it's unbalanced toward the right and the bottom. If you look at that as separate masses, which you could easily do if you broke it down into those. But technically speaking, there are three masses: the smallest flag, the one on top, then the one in the middle, and the largest mass is the one in the bottom or the background. Okay, and let's see. I think we've covered everything. There's no simulated texture. It's implied, and there's no modeling, none of either, unless you count the shadows created by the museum lighting underneath each flag. Okay, I think we've done pretty well. We're right, there we go. We're right at the point where we should be, and we have 4 more must-knows to cover on Wednesday, but you want to be here for the whole class, because that's when we will do the review and discussion of how the test is going to be given, and cut the study list, the most valuable exercises for both the definitions from the list of terms to know and from the syllabus of slides that you need to study. We'll cut them both by over a third. I think 40% is what I usually, it's right here in writing. So let us know. So remember, if you join the class late, the test is at the regular time and it's not going to be recorded. So you need to be logged in by 3:05 or so, because the first slide will appear on the screen on Monday, the 12th of December, 1 week from today at 3:15. And then I'll sign off at 4:30, but you can keep working. You'll get an email, send it tonight with all these instructions specifically. But I always promise to cut down the study list by a specific amount, and it's been so many weeks I have to go back and
is there going to be any Andy Warhol?
Yeah,
We're not covering Andy
look at the
Warhol?
syllabus. Look at the syllabus. It's a good question, but I wouldn't. What do you see?
Because I was going to say, how could you not include him?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, we are. And we're going to talk about one of the more tragic subjects of his brilliance.
Sad.
Yeah. Gold, Maryland. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you see it's on the syllabus that'll be on Wednesday before we do the review. Okay, here we go. I said before the midterm. Okay, and 50% before the final. Wow, I usually say 40, so you guys are going to get even bigger break. I think I upped that because there are more slides after the midterm, of course, than before. So at least, half of the slides will be cut, probably just about exactly that. And then on the definitions, we don't have that many, so I won't cut them by more than a third. But we'll do both in class. You want to be here for that on Wednesday. Okay, any questions now?
Some of these slides were not in my book, so
yeah, I mentioned at the beginning of the semester that you can find them almost every online art.
Yeah.
Course, or another textbook, which I mentioned that there's a Gardner's History of Art or Jansen's. We don't use Jansen because it wasn't very inclusive of artists of color or female artists.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah, it's an old school textbook written by, he's dead now, and his son was writing it for a while, but you'd think the son would be more inclusive.
Yeah.
So we abandoned Jansen. We used to use
terrible.
It, but Stockstead has always been very open about adding new. The only thing I don't like is she cut Julia Morgan out of the 20th century architecture section. For heaven's sakes, the first American woman.
Yes.
I don't get that. But anyway, I cover that, as you know. And yes, we will. I talk about which slides are the most likely on Wednesday when we do the review to be on these. I've already done that, but I'll recap that. Okay, so any questions anybody has? Don't forget you have until Friday. If you haven't, I read the names at the beginning of this lecture, and you should have been here if that would applied to any of the 5 or 6 people who I still don't have all 3 assignments from yet. You have until Friday to turn them in, midnight Friday. That's the deadline.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there a place that we can look at our grades? Because I know you don't use
I
Canvas.
send them to you. Email me.
Okay, I
It's
will.
confident. Absolutely. I will tell you exactly how many points you have, and then you'll know how
Okay.
many you need to get. Yeah. And if we were in an
Awesome.
in-person class, you could do that at the break, but we can't do that
Mhm.
here, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Have a nice
absolutely.
weekend.
You'll get that information as soon as I see your email. Okay.
I know.
Yes.
I just want to say something. I know someone who was, well, he's a photographer too. And he does a lot of photographs for magazines and different things and editorials. He was walking in New York and he was in Central Park, and he said that there he was walking, and Andy Warhol was right in front of him.
Hmm.
And he said, "Oh my gosh." He said, "I'm a big fan of yours. I'm a photographer. Would you allow me to photograph you?" And he said, "Yes." And he let him photograph
Oh,
him right in
I
Central
keep
Park.
hearing he was very protective of his privacy, but I don't know if that's true. That could be a real.
Oh, I saw the photos.
Well, I believe you
Saw the
totally, of
photos.
course. I mean, yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah.
But he said he knew he was private too, but for some strange reason, Mike appealed to him,
Sure,
and he said, "Sure."
exactly. It's just like I don't know if my mother ever did meet, let alone talk to George O'Keeffe, but my mother had a way of talking way into places no one else could get in.
Interesting.
So we'll assume she did, but we'll never know.
How
Yeah,
interesting.
that's a nursing anecdote. Yeah. Okay, so well, we'll see you all. I was going to ask you, but there are too few people now. I'm going to ask people to say if there's still 3 or 4 or 5 left. If you like this class, maybe take a few minutes to post a review of it, brief, just a few sentences on Rate My Professor, because it helps other students. I can give you extra credit for that. That'd be a conflict, right? But I'll repeat that announcement and mention it in an email, because it's the only way some students know if they don't know which professors in which certain departments they might or might not like to take a class from. If you felt you learned something from this class and got some positive experience out of it, I hope most of you did, you might take a few minutes, if not before finals, and maybe just after, to before maybe Christmas, because that's when students are signing up for classes. Open enrollment starts on the 8th of December, so it's coming up. So I meant to mention that at the beginning of the class, but now it'll be recorded as posted, and I'll repeat that briefly at the start of class on Wednesday. I think it's a valuable service. I like that website, and my daughters used it to take classes in other departments to find out which teachers she thought would be best, and I'm sure many of you have. RateMyProfessor.com if you feel you got something positive out of the class. Okay, see you guys on Wednesday. All right, take care. Have a good 2 days. All right, see you around. Bye. See you in 2 days. Wednesday.